Who invited her? The words cut through the mahogany-paneled boardroom of Lockridge Corporation like a blade through silk. Patricia Lockridge's voice carried the particular venom that only generations of inherited wealth could perfect, sharp enough to wound, refined enough to maintain plausible deniability in polite society. Danielle Rhodes paused at the threshold of the 42nd floor conference room, her hand still resting on the polished brass door handle that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The question hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar, acrid and lingering. Around the massive oval table sat 8 white men in identical navy suits, their faces turning toward her with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to barely concealed disdain. She had expected this moment, had prepared for it, even rehearsed it during sleepless nights in her penthouse overlooking the Chicago River. But feeling the collective weight of their stares, calculating, dismissive, predatory, still sent a familiar chill down her spine. It was the same look she'd received countless times before, in boardrooms across Manhattan, at networking events in Beverly Hills, in first-class airline lounges from coast to coast. The look that said, "You don't belong here." The look that said, "We know what you really are." What they didn't know, couldn't possibly comprehend, was that in exactly 37 minutes, this room would witness one of the most spectacular reversals of fortune in Chicago's corporate history. What they couldn't see beneath her deliberately modest appearance, the simple black blazer from Nordstrom rather than Armani, the unremarkable leather tote instead of designer handbag, the absence of any jewelry that might hint at serious wealth, was the woman who held the key to their family's financial future in her manicured hands. Danielle stepped fully into the room, her low heels silent against the Persian rug that probably cost more than most people's cars. She offered a polite smile to the assembled board members, noting with clinical precision how William Lockridge III didn't rise from his throne-like chair at the head of the table, how his brother James barely glanced up from his phone, how the oil paintings of long-dead Lockridge patriarchs seemed to glower down at her from their gilded frames like disapproving ancestors. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only by the soft hum of climate control and the distant sound of Chicago traffic 42 floors below. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady and professional, carrying just a hint of the Southern accent she'd never quite managed to eliminate, despite decades in corporate America. "I'm Danielle Rhodes from Rhodes Capital Management." The silence that followed was deafening, pregnant with assumptions and barely restrained judgment. The morning had started 3 hours earlier in the gleaming marble lobby of the Lockridge Tower, where Danielle had first encountered the particular brand of hostility that money and lineage could purchase. The space was designed to intimidate: soaring ceilings, imported marble, oil paintings of the founding fathers gazing down with patrician disapproval. It was old money flexing its muscles, a temple to generational wealth that had never questioned its right to exist. The receptionist, a blonde woman whose manicure probably cost more than some people's rent, had looked up from her marble desk with the expression of someone who had just discovered something unpleasant on the bottom of her designer shoe. Her nameplate read Madison Wright in elegant script, and everything about her screamed expensive finishing school and family connections. "I'm sorry. Do you have an appointment?" The question came loaded with skepticism, as if the very idea of Danielle having legitimate business in this temple to generational wealth was patently absurd. "Yes, I'm here to see William Lockridge regarding the investment proposal discussion. The meeting is scheduled for 10:30. Danielle had kept her tone even, professional, despite the familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same knot that had formed in dozens of similar situations over the past 2 decades. Madison's perfectly sculpted eyebrows had risen incrementally, a movement so subtle it might have been imperceptible to someone less attuned to microaggressions. "And you are?" "Danielle Rhodes, Chief Executive Officer of Rhodes Capital Management." She had emphasized the title slightly, watching Madison's reaction with scientific interest. A pause. A glance at the computer screen that lasted just a beat too long. Another pause, longer this time, filled with the soft clicking of manicured nails against keyboard keys and the subtle sound of judgment being passed. "I don't see you on Mr. Lockridge's calendar this morning. Are you quite sure you're in the right building? Sometimes people get confused about locations." "I'm quite certain." Danielle had pulled out her phone, scrolling to the email confirmation she'd received 3 days prior. The meeting was confirmed for 10:30, executive boardroom level, regarding the $5 billion investment proposal for Lockridge Corporation's expansion initiative. The mention of the dollar amount had caused Madison's expression to shift from dismissive to actively suspicious, as if Danielle had just claimed to be related to royalty. "$5 billion? I think there might be some mistake here. Perhaps you're looking for one of our subsidiaries. Or maybe you're here for the Diversity Initiative meeting. That's usually held in Conference Room B on the 15th floor. They handle those types of programs." The words hit their target with surgical precision, each syllable carefully chosen to wound while maintaining a veneer of helpfulness. Around the lobby, other visitors, all white, all male, all wearing suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary, pretended not to listen while hanging on every word of the exchange. Security had been called, of course, 2 men in dark suits who approached with the kind of casual authority that suggested they were well accustomed to removing undesirable elements from the premises. The older one, his gray hair cropped military short, had the bearing of ex-law enforcement. The younger one, hand resting casually on his radio, looked Danielle up and down like she was a potential shoplifter in a high-end boutique. "Ma'am, is there some kind of problem here?" His voice carried the particular tone that security guards used when they'd already decided who the problem was. By the time Danielle had produced 3 forms of identification, shown her business cards, displayed her corporate credentials, and allowed them to verify her information with their system, a process that seemed to take an unusually long time and involve multiple phone calls, a small crowd had gathered in the marble atrium. Employees on their way to lunch meetings, delivery workers making their rounds, other visitors, all watching the spectacle of a black woman being interrogated in the cathedral of corporate power. The whispers had started then, soft enough to maintain plausible deniability, but loud enough to ensure she heard every carefully chosen word. Probably someone's assistant getting ideas above her station. You know how they are with the diversity requirements these days. Have to let them in somewhere. I heard they have quotas now. Companies have to meet certain numbers. Wonder what she really wants. They always want something. Through it all, Danielle had maintained her composure with the skill of someone who had navigated these treacherous waters for 20 years, had smiled politely, answered questions she shouldn't have had to answer, produced documentation she shouldn't have had to produce, endured scrutiny that wouldn't have been applied to any white person in a similar situation. But inside, beneath the professional facade, she was taking careful notes, mental photographs, recording every slight, every assumption, every moment of casual cruelty that would soon prove to be the most expensive 30 minutes in Lockridge Corporation's 120-year history. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor had been its own exercise in subtle hostility. Madison had insisted on personally escorting her, just to make sure there are no more misunderstandings. The 20-something executive assistant had spent the entire ride making small talk that wasn't really small talk at all. "So you work in investments?" The pause before investments had been loaded with skepticism. "That's right. We focus on large-scale acquisitions and strategic partnerships." "How interesting. And you've been doing this for how long?" The questions had continued, each one designed to probe, to find the weakness, to determine whether Danielle was really qualified to be in that elevator, in that building, in that world. Madison's phone had buzzed constantly with text messages, and Danielle caught glimpses of the conversation. She's actually here. Looks exactly like you'd expect. William is going to lose his mind. Now, standing in the boardroom where the real power resided, Danielle could see that the gauntlet in the lobby had merely been the opening act. The main performance was about to begin. William Lockridge III finally looked up from his papers, his gray eyes conducting a slow, deliberate appraisal that felt like being processed through customs by a particularly suspicious agent. He was a man who wore his privilege like a perfectly tailored Savile Row suit, expensive, immaculate, and impossible to ignore. Silver hair swept back from a face that had never known want, never questioned its right to occupy the best chair in any room, never doubted that the world was arranged for his convenience and pleasure. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds, long enough to make most people uncomfortable, long enough to establish dominance. It was a power play Danielle recognized from dozens of similar encounters, the corporate equivalent of an alpha dog asserting territory. Ms. Rhodes. He didn't stand, didn't extend a hand, didn't perform any of the small courtesies that typically accompanied business introductions at this level. The omission was deliberate, calculated to establish hierarchy from the first moment. I have to admit I was expecting someone different. The statement hung in the air like a question that wasn't quite a question, an accusation that wasn't quite an accusation. Around the table, the other board members, James Lockridge looking like a younger, hungrier version of his brother, CFO Margaret Steinberg with her steel gray hair and sharper suit, General Counsel David Hayes clutching a legal pad like a shield, and 4 other men whose names and titles Danielle had memorized from their public filings, watched with the hungry attention of spectators at a gladiatorial match. Different how? Danielle took the seat at the opposite end of the table that hadn't been offered, placing her leather portfolio on the polished mahogany surface with deliberate care. She noticed how the simple gesture caused several board members to exchange meaningful glances, as if her presumption in sitting without permission confirmed their suspicions about her character. Well, William leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in a gesture that probably played well in intimidation scenarios, but struck Danielle as theatrical. When someone proposes to invest $5 billion in our company, we typically expect to deal with, how should I put this diplomatically, more established players in the market. Firms with longer track records, deeper relationships, more traditional approaches to investment strategy. James Lockridge, younger than his brother but carved from the same expensive marble, decided to join the conversation with the enthusiasm of someone who enjoyed intellectual blood sports. What my brother is trying to say, Ms. Rhodes, is that Rhodes Capital Management isn't exactly what you'd call a household name in our circles. We've done our research, of course, and while your fund certainly exists on paper, the question becomes whether it has the institutional sophistication and the relationship capital to handle a transaction of this magnitude and complexity. Danielle opened her portfolio with practiced calm, extracting a bound presentation that she'd spent 2 weeks perfecting with her team of analysts and graphic designers. I think you'll find that our credentials speak quite eloquently for themselves. Rhodes Capital currently manages assets worth $2.7 billion across diversified portfolios in technology, healthcare, renewable energy, and emerging markets. Our 5-year returns have consistently outperformed the S&P 500 by an average of 12% annually. Manages, Margaret Steinberg repeated, as if the word tasted unpleasant on her tongue. Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone who had spent decades in corporate finance, someone accustomed to dissecting financial statements and finding the weaknesses. But the question isn't about management, is it? The question is about actual capital deployment. Who are your investors? Who's providing the real money behind these numbers? Because managing other people's assets and having $5 billion to deploy in a single transaction are very different things. Our client list is confidential, as I'm sure you understand, given the sensitive nature of high net worth portfolio management. Danielle turned to the first page of her presentation, which displayed Rhodes Capital's performance metrics in crisp charts and graphs. What I can share is our track record of successful large-scale investments and our reputation for thorough due diligence and strategic partnership development. Track record. David Hayes, the general counsel, spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun. His voice carried the particular authority of a man who had spent his career finding the flaws in other people's arguments, the loopholes in contracts, the weak points in business proposals. 5 years isn't very long in the investment world, Ms. Rhodes. Most of the serious institutional investors we work with have decades of proven performance, relationships that go back generations, track records that span multiple market cycles. And most of those funds, William added with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, the kind of expression that looked warm in photographs but felt cold in person, are run by people we've known for years, people whose families we've done business with for decades, people who understand our culture, our values, our particular way of approaching these kinds of partnerships. The subtext wasn't subtle. It didn't need to be. In rooms like this, among people like this, certain truths could be spoken without words, certain assumptions could be made without explicit statement. The language of exclusion was as refined and practiced as their taste in wine and art. Danielle felt the familiar weight of 100 similar conversations pressing down on her shoulders, job interviews where she was overqualified but somehow not the right fit, networking events where she was welcomed with professional smiles and polite distance, board meetings where her ideas were praised and then credited to someone else. But she also felt something else building beneath the surface, a cold, calculating satisfaction. They were giving her everything she needed, every piece of evidence she would require for what came next. Your culture and values, she repeated slowly as if testing the words on her tongue. Could you elaborate on what you mean by that? The question seemed to catch William slightly off guard. He had expected pushback, defensiveness, perhaps anger. He had expected her to protest their implications or demand to know what they meant by people like us. He hadn't expected her to ask for clarification with such clinical precision. Well, we're fundamentally a family business, he said finally, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a slow student. 5 generations of Lockridges have built this company on certain foundational principles: integrity, tradition, excellence, personal relationships, long-term thinking. We work with investment partners who share those principles, who understand the importance of maintaining our corporate culture and our reputation in the community. And you're concerned that I might not share those principles? I wouldn't say concerned exactly, James interjected, his voice carrying the particular brand of condescension that came naturally to men who had never had their qualifications questioned. I'd say we're simply being prudent. We're talking about a partnership that could last decades, an investment relationship that needs to work on multiple levels. We need to be absolutely certain that we're aligned not just financially, but culturally, philosophically, strategically. Around the table, Danielle could see the other board members settling into their roles in this corporate theater. Some nodded sagely at James's words, others studied their papers with exaggerated attention, all of them complicit in the careful dance of exclusion playing out before them. What they couldn't know, couldn't possibly imagine, was that every word, every gesture, every carefully coded euphemism was being captured by the small recording device clipped to her blazer lapel. What they couldn't see was that their private boardroom conversation was being monitored in real time by her team of attorneys, investigators, and public relations specialists who were positioned in offices across the city, waiting for her signal to begin the most comprehensive corporate takedown in Chicago's modern history. The polished mahogany door to the boardroom opened with the whisper-soft precision of expensive German engineering, and Patricia Lockridge swept into the room like a queen entering her throne room. She moved with the particular grace that came from decades of cotillion classes and finishing school. her posture perfect, her movements calculated for maximum impact. She was dressed in what Danielle immediately recognized as Chanel, not the kind you bought off the rack, but the kind that was tailored specifically for your body by seamstresses who charged more per hour than most people made in a week. Her entrance was theater, pure and simple, the kind of carefully orchestrated performance that old money had perfected over generations, designed to remind everyone in the room exactly who belonged and who didn't. She carried herself with the particular arrogance that came from never having to question your right to be anywhere, never having to prove your worth, never having to justify your presence in any space. Her gaze swept the room with the lazy confidence of a predator surveying its territory, pausing briefly on each board member with the kind of familiarity that spoke of years of social interaction, charity galas, and country club conversations. When her eyes finally settled on Danielle, her expression shifted subtly, like someone who had just discovered something distasteful in an otherwise perfect arrangement. "William, darling, I hope I'm not interrupting anything terribly important." Her voice was honey over broken glass, sweet on the surface but with edges sharp enough to cut. "I was just having lunch with the girls at the club, and I was telling them all about your exciting meeting today. They were absolutely fascinated by the prospect of new investment opportunities." She moved with deliberate slowness to stand behind her husband's chair, her perfectly manicured hands coming to rest on his shoulders in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. Her engagement ring, a diamond solitaire that could have funded a small nonprofit for a year, caught the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows and threw rainbows across the polished conference table. "Patricia," William said, and Danielle caught the subtle note of warning in his voice, the tone of a man who recognized that his wife's presence might complicate an already delicate situation. "Ms. Rhodes." Patricia repeated the name as if she were tasting wine that had turned to vinegar, her voice carrying the kind of disdain that could only be cultivated through generations of looking down on people from great height. "How absolutely interesting. I have to say I'm quite curious about you. What exactly qualifies you to be here, sitting in our family's boardroom, discussing matters of such significance?" The question was a masterpiece of passive aggression, carefully constructed to deliver maximum damage while maintaining enough plausible deniability to deflect accusations of outright hostility. It was the kind of weapon that wealthy women had been perfecting in drawing rooms and country clubs for centuries, sharp enough to wound, but refined enough to be defended as mere curiosity. Danielle felt the familiar heat rising in her chest, the old anger that she had learned over 2 decades to channel into something colder, more useful, more dangerous. Around the table, she could see the board members watching with the fascination of people who had found unexpected entertainment with their morning coffee. "I'm qualified to be here, Mrs. Lockridge, because Rhodes Capital Management has the financial resources, the strategic expertise, and the due diligence capabilities to execute a $5 billion investment in Lockridge Corporation," she said, her voice remaining perfectly level despite the fire building behind her professional facade. "Our proposal offers terms that would be highly beneficial to your shareholders and could position the company for significant growth in emerging markets." Patricia's laugh was like expensive crystal-hitting marble, sharp, bright, and designed to shatter things. "Oh, sweetheart, I think there might be some confusion here, some misunderstanding about how things work in our world. You see, the Lockridge Corporation doesn't typically work with, well, let's just say we're very selective about our partnerships. We work with established firms, with people we know and trust, with families that have been in this business for generations." The euphemisms were piling up like snow, each one adding another layer to the mountain of barely concealed bigotry. William shifted uncomfortably in his chair, perhaps recognizing that his wife was saying things that would be difficult to walk back, crossing lines that might have legal implications. "What my wife is trying to say," William interjected, though his tone suggested he wasn't trying to soften anything at all, merely provide a more diplomatic wrapper for the same poison, is that compatibility is crucial in these kinds of long-term partnerships. There might be a better fit for your particular perspective in the market. Have you considered reaching out to some of the minority-focused investment groups? I'm sure they would be very interested in what you have to offer. Around the table, Danielle could see the other board members nodding in agreement, their faces wearing expressions of benevolent condescension that made her skin crawl. It was the look of people who believed they were being helpful, who thought they were doing her a favor by directing her toward what they considered more appropriate opportunities. James Lockridge leaned forward across the mahogany table, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow child. Look, Ms. Rhodes, I'm sure you're very capable at what you do, but we're talking about a $5 billion transaction here. This is serious money, serious responsibility, serious scrutiny from regulators and stakeholders. We need investment partners who can handle that level of complexity, that level of public attention, that level of fiduciary responsibility. Partners, Margaret Steinberg added with surgical precision, who won't attract the wrong kind of attention to the transaction. Partners who won't turn this into some kind of political statement or social justice initiative. Partners who understand that business is business, not activism. The words hung in the air like toxic gas, poisoning the atmosphere of the room. Danielle reached for her phone, ostensibly to check the time, but actually to send a text message that consisted of exactly 4 words. Activate Plan B, now. She looked up from her phone with an expression of carefully constructed confusion, the kind of look that suggested she was trying very hard to understand something that didn't quite make sense to her. I want to make sure I'm interpreting this correctly. Are you saying that my race is a factor in your decision-making process regarding this investment proposal? The question landed in the room like a live grenade, and suddenly everyone was very interested in their papers, their phones, the oil paintings on the walls, anywhere but Danielle's face. The silence stretched for nearly 15 seconds. Long enough for everyone to fully appreciate the legal and public relations landmine that had just been armed and placed in the center of their mahogany conference table. William's jaw tightened visibly, the muscles in his face contracting as he realized that the conversation had moved into genuinely dangerous territory. That's not what we're saying at all, Ms. Rhodes. That would be inappropriate and, frankly, illegal. What we're pointing out is that cultural compatibility is an important factor in any long-term business partnership. We need to work with people who understand our values, our traditions, our approach to conducting business. And you don't believe that I understand those values? Patricia, apparently unaware of or unconcerned about the legal implications of what she was about to say, decided to double down on her position with the confidence of someone who had never faced serious consequences for her words. I think, dear, that you might be more comfortable working with companies that are more aligned with your particular community and interests. Companies that specialize in diversity initiatives, urban development projects, that sort of thing. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, of course. Everyone has their place in the business ecosystem. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the climate control system and the distant sound of Chicago traffic filtering up from the street 42 floors below. Even the air conditioning seemed to have paused, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Danielle closed her leather portfolio with deliberate care, the soft whisper of expensive leather against polished wood somehow managing to sound like a gunshot in the absolute stillness of the room. When she looked up, her expression was perfectly calm, perfectly professional, perfectly controlled. But there was something new in her eyes, something that made several board members shift uncomfortably in their chairs. I want to make absolutely certain that I understand your position correctly, she said, her voice as steady as a surgeon's scalpel making the first incision. You are telling me that despite Rhodes Capital's demonstrated financial qualifications, despite our proven track record of successful large-scale investments, Despite our competitive proposal and thorough due diligence, you are declining to move forward with this partnership because of what you term cultural fit. Because you believe I might not understand your values and traditions. She made a note in her portfolio that was visible to those close enough to see it. 10:52 a.m. Explicit cultural fit discrimination. Multiple witnesses present. Recording active. Looking around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn with the kind of direct gaze that made grown men remember childhood encounters with disappointed teachers, she continued. I think I understand your position perfectly now. You've made your values and your decision-making criteria very clear. The question that remains is whether you understand mine. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text message. She glanced at it and smiled, not the polite professional expression she had been wearing since entering the room, but something colder, sharper, infinitely more dangerous. I have a feeling, she said, gathering her things with unhurried precision, that we're about to have a very interesting conversation about cultural fit and business compatibility. Very interesting indeed. The tension in the boardroom crackled like electricity before a summer storm, as Danielle remained standing at the head of the mahogany table, her hands resting calmly on her leather portfolio, while her eyes swept the room with clinical precision. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their expensive chairs, suddenly aware that their carefully orchestrated humiliation wasn't proceeding according to the script they had expected. William Lockridge III pushed back from the table, with enough force to make his chair roll several inches across the Persian rug, his face flushing red beneath his perfectly groomed silver hair. When he stood, his full height and the authority of his position filled the room like a physical presence. Are you threatening us, Ms. Rhodes? Are you standing in our boardroom, in our building, in our company, and making some kind of veiled threat against the Lockridge family? His voice carried the outrage of a man who had never been challenged in his own domain, never had his authority questioned by someone he considered beneath his social station. Around the table, the other board members were watching the confrontation with the fascination of spectators at a car accident, horrified but unable to look away. I'm not threatening anyone, Mr. Lockridge, Danielle replied, her tone as level as a federal judge announcing a sentence. I'm simply observing that actions have consequences in the modern business environment, that words spoken in boardrooms don't always stay in boardrooms, that decisions made behind closed doors don't always remain private in an age of social media, regulatory scrutiny, and corporate accountability. Patricia Lockridge moved closer to her husband, her hand tightening on his shoulder in a gesture that was equal parts possessive and protective. Her earlier confidence was beginning to show hairline cracks, like expensive porcelain under stress. How dare you speak to us that way? Do you have any idea who we are? What this family has built over 5 generations? You walk into our building, into our private meeting, and you think you can intimidate us with your implications and your attitude? James Lockridge stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the Persian rug with a sound like fingernails on slate. His face had gone pale except for 2 spots of red high on his cheekbones, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. That's enough. Enough of this charade. Security should have caught this from the beginning. We don't have to tolerate this kind of disruption in our own boardroom. He reached for the sleek black phone at the center of the conference table, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Danielle said quietly, her voice cutting through the rising tension like a blade through silk. The words stopped James mid-reach, his hand hovering over the phone as if it had suddenly become radioactive. There was something in her tone, not panic, not pleading, but a cold certainty that made everyone in the room pause and reconsider what they thought they knew about the woman standing before them. Margaret Steinberg, who had been silent during the escalating confrontation, finally spoke up with the diplomatic caution of someone whose legal training was screaming warnings in the back of her mind. Ms. Rhodes, I think perhaps we should all take a step back here. Clearly there's been some miscommunication, some misunderstanding of intentions. Maybe we should reschedule this meeting when everyone has had time to cool down and reconsider their positions." "There has been no miscommunication," Danielle interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to being heard in rooms full of powerful people. "The communication has been crystal clear from the moment I walked into this building. Every word, every gesture, every assumption you've made about me has been perfectly, transparently clear." James picked up the phone despite her warning, his jaw set with the determination of someone who had decided that the best defense was a strong offense. "Security, this is James Lockridge. We need someone in the executive boardroom immediately. We have a situation that requires immediate attention." Patricia was already moving toward the door, her heels clicking against the hardwood with the sharp staccato rhythm of machine gun fire. "I'm calling building security myself. This has gone far enough. People like her are all the same. They come in here with their victim mentality and their threats, thinking they can shake down successful families like some kind of corporate extortion scheme." "People like me," Danielle repeated, pulling out her phone to reveal a screen showing 3 missed calls and 7 text messages, all marked urgent. "And what exactly are people like me like, Mrs. Lockridge? I'm genuinely curious about your assessment." The question was a trap, and Patricia walked into it with the confidence of someone who had never faced serious consequences for expressing her true thoughts about people she considered beneath her social station. "You know exactly what I mean. Coming in here with your lawsuits and your discrimination claims and your social justice nonsense, thinking you can force your way into places where you simply don't belong. Thinking you can use guilt and political correctness to get what you want instead of earning it the way everyone else does." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft chime of Danielle's phone receiving another text message. She glanced at it, and for the first time since entering the room, her professional mask slipped slightly, not into anger or hurt, but into something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. "Places where I don't belong," she said, looking up from her phone with an expression that made several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "That's a very interesting phrase, Mrs. Lockridge, because I'm beginning to think that maybe I belong here more than any of you realize. Maybe I belong here in ways that you can't even begin to imagine." William stood up fully now, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. The conversation had spiraled far beyond his control, moved into territory that his legal training told him was dangerous for everyone involved. "Get out! Get out of our building, off our property, before we have you arrested for trespassing and harassment. And if you even think about trying to twist this into some kind of discrimination lawsuit, you'll find out exactly what the Lockridge family legal team is capable of when they're defending our reputation and our business." "The Lockridge family legal team," Danielle repeated thoughtfully, as if she were tasting the words and finding them interesting. "Yes, I imagine they're very expensive. Very well connected, very accustomed to making problems disappear for wealthy clients. But I wonder how they'll handle a problem that doesn't want to disappear. A problem that has resources of its own. A problem that has been recording every single word of this conversation." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in the span of a heartbeat. David Hayes, the general counsel, went pale as fresh snow, his legal mind immediately calculating the implications of what she had just revealed. Margaret Steinberg looked like she was going to be physically sick. James Lockridge, still holding the phone to his ear while speaking to security, seemed frozen in mid-conversation. "You're bluffing," Patricia said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried just moments before. Danielle reached into her blazer with deliberate slowness and pulled out a small device, barely larger than a button, that had been clipped to her lapel throughout the entire meeting. She held it up so everyone in the room could see it clearly, rotating it between her fingers like a jeweler displaying a precious stone. "Illinois is a one-party consent state, Mrs. Lockridge. I'm legally entitled to record any conversation that I'm a participant in. Every word you've said, every assumption you've made, every cultural fit euphemism you've used, it's all been documented, time-stamped, legally admissible, and currently being transcribed by a team of attorneys who specialize in employment discrimination law. The boardroom erupted into chaos. William started shouting about illegal surveillance and corporate espionage. Patricia demanded to know who Danielle really worked for and what her real agenda was. James was yelling into the phone about security breaches and potential lawsuits. The other board members were talking over each other, their voices rising in panic and confusion as they tried to process the implications of what they had just learned. But through it all, Danielle remained perfectly calm, standing at the head of the table like the eye of a hurricane, watching the implosion with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a controlled explosion. Her phone was buzzing constantly now, messages streaming in from her team as they monitored the situation and prepared to execute the next phase of a plan that had been 18 months in the making. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Lockridge," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a bell, "I think you might want to check your phones. You're about to receive some very interesting information." The pandemonium in the boardroom was interrupted by the sharp, insistent buzz of William Lockridge's phone against the mahogany table. Then Margaret Steinberg's device chimed with an urgent notification. Then David Hayes's phone began ringing with the aggressive persistence of a fire alarm. Within 30 seconds, every electronic device in the room was vibrating, chiming, or ringing with the kind of urgency typically reserved for natural disasters or national emergencies. William grabbed his phone first, his hands shaking slightly as he read the notification from his CFO. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a kind of gray-faced horror that made him look 10 years older in the span of 10 seconds. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, staring at the screen as if it might spontaneously combust. "How is this even possible?" The message was marked urgent in blazing red letters. "Sir, Rhodes Capital has formally withdrawn the $5 billion investment proposal. Stock price is in free fall. Trading has been temporarily suspended. Board emergency meeting requested. Call me immediately." Margaret Steinberg was staring at her own phone with the expression of someone who had just received news of a death in the family. Her CFO training allowed her to process financial catastrophe faster than the others, and what she was seeing on her screen made her physically recoil from the device. "William," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of impending disaster, "we need to talk. Right now. Privately. This is catastrophic." James Lockridge had gone completely white, his face the color of fresh snow as he held his phone to his ear, trying desperately to reach someone who clearly wasn't answering. "This has to be some kind of mistake," he kept repeating like a mantra. "Some kind of technical error in the system. There's no way this is real." Patricia looked around the room with growing panic, her earlier arrogance evaporating like morning mist as she watched the men in her life transform into panicked children before her eyes. "What's happening? What are all these messages? Someone needs to explain to me what's going on right now." Danielle remained standing at the head of the table, her posture relaxed, her expression serene. She checked her own phone with the casual interest of someone reading the morning weather report, scrolling through what appeared to be dozens of messages and notifications. "Oh, excellent," she said, with the satisfied tone of someone whose carefully laid plans were proceeding exactly as intended. "My team certainly works efficiently. I do appreciate punctuality in business operations." "Your team?" William's voice cracked slightly on the words, aging him another decade in real time. "My legal team, my public relations team, my investment team, my communications specialists, my board of directors," Danielle said, opening her portfolio once again. But this time, instead of the investment proposals and financial projections they had seen earlier, she extracted a completely different set of documents: corporate filings, stock ownership records, voting trust agreements, and legal documentation that made several board members lean forward in their chairs with growing alarm. "You see, gentlemen, Mrs. Lockridge," she continued with the calm precision of a surgeon making the first incision, I think there might have been some fundamental confusion about the nature of today's meeting, some misunderstanding about who was asking whom for what. She spread the documents across the mahogany table like a dealer revealing a royal flush, each page landing with the soft whisper of expensive paper against polished wood. This meeting was never about Rhodes Capital begging for the privilege of investing in Lockridge Corporation. This meeting was about me, as your largest individual shareholder, deciding whether to continue my investment in this company or whether to liquidate my position and seek opportunities elsewhere. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, each syllable carrying the weight of financial ruin and corporate catastrophe. David Hayes, his legal training finally overriding his shock and panic, lunged for the documents with the desperate energy of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. His eyes scanned the pages with the practiced speed of someone accustomed to reading complex financial instruments, and with each line, each chart, each legal disclosure, his face grew paler and more drawn. "This isn't possible," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own rapid breathing. "These holdings, these shell companies, the voting trust arrangements, the acquisition timeline—" "Oh, it's very possible," Danielle replied with the pleasant tone of someone discussing the weather. "And more importantly, it's all completely legal. Rhodes Capital Management has been systematically acquiring Lockridge Corporation stock for the past 18 months through a carefully structured network of subsidiary companies, holding corporations, and investment vehicles." She paused to let that information sink in, watching the growing horror on their faces with clinical interest. Not directly, of course. That would have triggered disclosure requirements that would have ruined the surprise. But through a sophisticated network of shell companies and investment trusts that your own legal team helped structure back in 2018 when you were looking for ways to obscure certain, less palatable, investment relationships. Margaret Steinberg snatched the documents from David's trembling hands, her financial background allowing her to process the implications faster and more completely than the others. She scanned the pages with increasing disbelief, her lips moving silently as she calculated percentages and voting rights. 23%, she breathed, the words escaping her lips like air from a punctured tire. Rhodes Capital controls 23% of Lockridge Corporation stock. 23.7% to be completely precise, Danielle corrected with the satisfaction of someone who appreciated accuracy in all things. Which makes Rhodes Capital Management the largest single shareholder in Lockridge Corporation. Which means that every word you've said to me today, every assumption you've made about my qualifications, every euphemism and coded language you've used to dismiss me, you've been saying to the person who owns nearly a quarter of your company. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the climate control system and the distant sound of Chicago traffic filtering up from the street far below. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city continued its daily routine, while inside the boardroom a century-old empire was crumbling in real time. William's phone rang again, the sound sharp and jarring in the absolute stillness. He answered it without taking his eyes off Danielle, his voice hollow and distant, like a man speaking from the bottom of a well. "Yes, I know about the stock price. Yes, I see the market reaction. No, I don't know what—" "What?" His eyes widened to the point where white showed all around the irises. "The Chicago Tribune? They have what story? How could they possibly have—" "No, don't make any statements. Don't say anything to anyone until I can—" He ended the call and stared at Danielle with the expression of a man watching his life's work burn to the ground in real time. "You orchestrated this. All of it. The meeting, the recording, the stock manipulation, the media coverage, this was all planned." "I didn't orchestrate your words, Mr. Lockridge," Danielle replied with the calm authority of someone who had spent months preparing for this exact moment. "I didn't put those thoughts in your head or those beliefs in your heart. I didn't script your wife's comments about people knowing their place or your brother's assumptions about my qualifications." She gathered her documents with unhurried precision, each movement calculated to demonstrate complete control of the situation. I simply created an opportunity for you to show me, and as it turns out, the world, exactly who you are when you think no one of consequence is watching. And you did, magnificently, with a thoroughness and enthusiasm that exceeded even my most optimistic projections. The next 72 hours unfolded like a masterclass in modern corporate destruction, each development more devastating than the last. From her suite at the Four Seasons, a strategic choice that put her just blocks from both the financial district and the major media outlets, Danielle watched the Lockridge empire collapse with the methodical precision of a controlled demolition. The first domino fell at exactly 6 a.m. the following morning, when the Chicago Tribune's front-page story hit newsstands across the city. The headline was stark and uncompromising. Recorded racism. How Chicago's Lockridge dynasty lost 5B in one meeting. The article included carefully selected transcripts from the boardroom recording, each quote more damning than the last, building a narrative that was impossible to deny or dismiss. Patricia Lockridge's comments about people like her and knowing their place became instant lightning rods for social media outrage. Within hours, hashtags like Backer Lockridge racism and boardroom bigotry were trending nationally, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of workplace discrimination and corporate prejudice. The audio clips, professionally edited and legally vetted, spread across every platform until the Lockridge name became synonymous with the kind of institutional racism that many had hoped was a relic of the past. By noon on day one, Lockridge Corporation's stock price had fallen 37%. By market close, it was down 52%, wiping out nearly $2 billion in market capitalization in a single trading session. The financial media, always hungry for dramatic corporate narratives, pounced on the story with the enthusiasm of sharks scenting blood in the water. CNBC ran a segment titled "The Most Expensive Racist Rant in Corporate History," featuring a panel of experts dissecting how quickly prejudice could destroy shareholder value in the age of social media and instant global communication. Bloomberg published a detailed analysis of the company's financial vulnerability, noting how the loss of Rhodes Capital's investment had triggered a cascade of credit rating downgrades and loan covenant violations. But the financial damage, devastating as it was, proved to be only the beginning of the Lockridge family's troubles. The Peterson Group, Lockridge Corporation's oldest and most prestigious partnership, a relationship that stretched back 3 generations and encompassed everything from real estate development to private equity investments, issued a terse statement at exactly 2 p.m. on day 2. After careful review of recent allegations regarding Lockridge Corporation's corporate culture and leadership practices, Peterson Group has made the difficult decision to terminate all existing partnerships and contractual relationships, effective immediately. The announcement came with a price tag that made the stock decline look modest by comparison. $300 million in immediately canceled contracts, plus the loss of future deals that had been in various stages of negotiation. But more importantly, it triggered a domino effect that saw 5 other major partners, Henderson Industries, Goldman Sachs Private Wealth Management, Chicago Development Partners, Midwest Infrastructure Fund, and Sterling Advisory Group, follow suit within a matter of hours. Each departure was accompanied by carefully worded statements about reevaluating partnership criteria and ensuring alignment with corporate values. But the message was clear. Association with the Lockridge name had become a liability that no serious business could afford to maintain. William Lockridge III's personal downfall was as swift as it was surgical. The emergency board meeting convened at 8 a.m. on day 3 was less a discussion than a public execution, conducted with the cold efficiency of a military tribunal. Board members who had shared drinks with William at the Union League Club just days before now tripped over themselves to distance the company from their former leader. The motion of no confidence was introduced by Margaret Steinberg herself, a final betrayal that cut deeper than all the